My name is Jacqueline Robertson, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in California and Canada. It's an interesting title they give us because we don't all always practice marriage and family therapy. In fact, I see primarily individuals. I also see couples, but it sort of depends on who you ask and the specialty and their niche. So I tend to see a lot of adult women, about 25 to maybe mid 60s who have some kind of early childhood unresolved trauma, and they're struggling with anxiety, depression, relationships. Self-worth is a really big one, having self-compassion, and sometimes just feeling lost and finding their way in life. I also see a lot of grief and loss, which is another big part of my specialty, and trauma, across the board, which is a very broad spectrum in general. I do see couples, and where my heart really lies is in the individual work and women's issues in particular as well, especially women who are in life transitions and midlife transitions, who are kind of crossing that bridge. Often I'll use the term maiden to mother. So kind of transitioning from that young sort of adulthood, so to speak. They don't even have to be a teenager per se, maybe in their consciousness, right? In their psychology, in their developmental process, they're still feeling like they identify very much as that young teenager, but trying to come into adulthood and sort of their phase of the mother, whether they are actually a mother or not. So helping women to identify the mother within, to mother themselves. And it could be even more specifically that a part of her struggles to develop is because when we have trauma, often we developmentally get stuck. A part of us gets stuck at that age and sort of doesn't get to fully develop and grow psychologically. So we're operating often from those systems. We all have our path and our story and what led us here. And for me, it naturally goes back to childhood. And when I was 6 years old, my dad was 40 at the time, and he was playing recreational baseball, which he loved. It was one of his greatest passions and joys. And two things were not supposed to happen. Well, they weren't supposed to play that day. It was kind of a synchronistic series of events, and it was raining, and they weren't supposed to play when it rained, and the pitcher was absent, and still they decided to play that day. And my dad, who normally doesn't pitch, I think he normally played shortstop, volunteered and insisted that he pitch. And he pitched, and it was a pop-up fly, and the ball came down and hit him on the left side of the head, which is speech, language, Broca's area. And long story short, they took him to the hospital, gave him a 50-50 chance to live. And when he came out of the operation for brain surgery, he was, he lived, but he was a totally different human being. He had a traumatic brain injury, couldn't talk and communicate, and really kind of became a child overnight himself. So that was the pinnacle, the peak of kind of what set me on this path, generally speaking. We begin typically with some kind of clinical assessment and a series of, questions that help us to really understand where that individual is and, their developmental stages and their process and where they might be stuck. And, of course, we can look at symptoms, which are really a deeper sort of systemic response, often to trauma, unresolved trauma. And we can sort of from there figure out what goals and kind of what intentions they have and where they want to go with the work. So really, it begins with, like any good conversation, lots of questions, lots of curiosity. And I think that's a key word, is being curious. And even though I've been doing this for over 10 years, I still have to stay open to this person presents a very similar way as this person, but every human being and every childhood trauma imprint is unique and manifest similarly, but also it can be unique and different to the individual. No set of traumas are quite the same, and how they're imprinted on our nervous system and what they kind of manifest in those symptoms. I'm a history major, and so I'm a big fan of looking at, history in our past. And there's some therapies that say we don't need to look at our past. We can just look at the present and move forward. Attachment theory, which is a framework for how I practice, and a very common framework for many therapists, allows us to look at our history of childhood and those attachment figures, our mother and our father, and how they responded or didn't respond, and then how they inform our nervous systems and our beliefs. If we think about the collective or the culture, and historically, we could go down we could get into a really good rabbit hole of how the culture, and I'm going to throw out the word, the patriarchy, and we're seeing this right now in our political realm, how that has influenced human beings, men and women, because I also see men, obviously, men are very conditioned, women are very conditioned to what we're supposed to believe about ourselves, how we're supposed to think. I just wrote a newsletter this morning about self-trust and why women don't trust themselves, because it's kind of, I'm generalizing here, but go to any place in the world and there's conditioning and culture there and generational trauma from day one that goes way back. And this is also science. It's intergenerational trauma. It's in our DNA and cells. And so what we were not only taught in our early life, but what came before us. And with trauma work, we often say, when we do this type of work and healing, especially when we're sort of doing the depth work or the depth psychology of it, we can heal for 7 generations back. So if you believe in that, which I do, our ancestors who are no longer here, and 7 generations forward. So it is not just a childhood issue. People come in, couples come in, and they want to heal their marriage. Well, it's only one piece about the marriage, because we don't live in a village or a tribe anymore. So sometimes I feel overwhelmed with how much work needs to be done here. And then, I go back to basics. Where do we begin? With ourselves. I see women in the community, whether it be clinicians, licensed therapists, or coaches, facilitators, plant medicine guides, it's all individual, and we all come with our own history, right? And our own systems. And that's beautiful. But what I don't think is appropriate is to stay in chronic or consistent rage and anger at the patriarchy. Like it's only going to get us so far, right? We can't fight war with war. That's what we've been doing, right? And it doesn't work. We know that. History keeps repeating. Here we are. And here's where I feel really excited about helping both men and women, right? It's not just the women I want to help. I don't know. The word that comes to me is rehabilitate. It's the men. And I've been thinking about this a lot more. I'll just divert us for a moment, but connect and bring it back to why I became a therapist. I grew up after my father had the baseball accident with the brain injury, as you probably know, it changes the person's personality, changes everything, right? And my dad was, to no fault of his, very angry and really, I think, in deep grief. And so that was my model of my patriarch, of my masculine, of my father figure, like anger, rage. And I think, what that informed me of in my clinical work and practice is that also lives within me. I was witness and subject to that. And now it was never directed at me. It was out of frustration for not being able to communicate and function. He lost everything. And I wrote a book on it, which I can talk about later too. But I know that anger. We all know that anger. We have to take responsibility for our microaggressions. for our choices and our actions. And I'm not saying, it's our fault, but we have the adulthood consciousness. And Bill Plotkins, who is a really well-known, I think he's I don't know if he's a psychologist, but he's a psychotherapist, and he leads wilderness retreats, and he does vision quests. And he talks about this in his work and his books, that the part of the problem, again, in Western society is that we don't have rites of passages like we did historically. And we see this still in some indigenous cultures, right? We see this in certain tribes and cultures still in Western society, right? But it's been dying, and we're slowly seeing a reconnection to that, because we miss our elders in our community to teach us how to move through this anger and accept these terrible things that have happened, right? And that's really my core work in this life, is the grief work. Because the anger, the rage, all of it, when you boil it all down, quite often settling underneath that is deep grief. And Francis Weller, who is a fabulous therapist and grief, he wouldn't call himself a grief expert. I would. He talks a lot about this in his work, and how this is a big missing piece in our culture, right? And so grief ceremonies, grief rituals, processing the pain underneath all of the history is also critical. And so back to where you asked me, I feel very hopeful, because I have done that work in myself and continue to, and feel very committed to it, and help my clients and groups and people touch into that. As scary and overwhelming as it can be, I think it's really important and really beautiful work. So somatic therapy really addresses, so when we break that down, somatic, if we break it down to soma, which means body, right? It's body oriented, right? We know from research and from neuroscience that trauma really lives in the cells and tissues of our body. It lives in the nervous system. So talk therapy can kind of only take us so far if we're dealing with a deeper trauma, which we all have trauma. It's just to what degree, right? And so when we're doing somatic therapy, we're helping clients deepen and move from cognition, the analytical mind, the thinking, the analysis of the prefrontal cortex, and coming down and moving that energy into the being, right? Which is really hard for most of us, right? To just be and to connect and in presence, right? Be mindful. And so we help clients connect to feeling, which they often don't want to do. How can I think my way out of this? How can I change my belief? Which is great. But again, if we're dealing with trauma that's embedded in the neurology and the nervous system, we may need to go within and help to connect to the sensations, the qualities of the sensations, the warmth, right? Because that memory is stored in the body, and the story matches the memory. And so with, for example, EMDR therapy, which is a type of somatic therapy that reprocesses traumatic or difficult memories, we go down into the body and we connect the client to the memory, and we actually activate it and connect them to the feeling. And we use mindfulness, and we use something called bilateral stimulation, which can be done by tapping. And we let them feel and revisit the memory, but we also let them complete the memory in a new way, that it's not held so painfully or intensely, sensationally in the body, so they can complete it and have a new recording of the memory with with kind of like a different outcome, if you will, that has a new story. So it's not a playing on repeat every time they get triggered in this thing. EMDR doesn't obviously erase, we can't erase memories, but what happens is when we have a traumatic memory, it gets stuck. And so we get into that looping. And then when we get triggered and something reminds us, it feels or sounds or smells or senses like that memory, right? A mother yelling at her child and telling the child, go to your room and be a good girl. And then that person as an adult has a partner and they have some kind of essence of that experience again, even if they didn't say that directly, all you need is just the subtle, that reminds me of mom when I was 5, and the body goes into a trigger. Well, what we're doing with EMDR and somatic work is we're helping the client to basically complete that trigger. So it's like it got stuck on fight, flight, freeze. And when we process somatically, we get to come down and complete that sort of curve so that the energy, the way it's been held historically in the body and nervous system, gets discharged and complete, if you will. Once that happens, then we can begin to access a new feeling and new perspective. And all of a sudden, we can re-record that memory with a new response from the adult wise self, if you will. So the child within is not being triggered every single time. So there's many ways in which psychedelic assisted psychotherapy can take place. For now, I'll keep it sort of general, but we could split it into directive or non-directive. Non-directive is going to be sort of your classical model of, and we see this sort of in MAPS, right? Where the training looks like for clinicians and for clients, right? The therapist, sometimes there's 1 or 2 therapists in the room. There's a playlist created and crafted carefully for the client. The client puts a mask on. They've done a bunch of preparation work. I should really add that. That's really critical, right? We always do it a lot. I extra emphasize the preparation. I don't take anyone on. Some people will call me and they want to do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and I'll say, great, let's do a consultation and assessment. And then let's spend some time together because the relationship is critical, right? The safety and the trust we need to build. Basically, once we have that in place, then we can decide if we're going to be non-directive, which is sort of that mask where they put on the mask, the music, and they go in and they get the information inside, right? One of my old therapists would say, the gold is all inside, right? Which is true because it's in that somatic approach in the body. Now that looks like the therapist has very little interaction. They're there. They're still being a supportive guide and helping them, if they need help, and there's directions around that. If you need help, ask, or if you need support or some guidance or direction, but they're kind of hands off, right? Not that we're ever hands on. That's non-directive. A directive approach is when the clinician, the therapist, is actually engaging and the client is not wearing a mask, and they're relational, which is very attachment oriented, and actually really a critical piece that the non-directional psychedelic assisted therapy, I think, misses sometimes, because we wound in relationship with another human being. And so if we're asked to go inside and just get all the gold on our own, and we don't have that attachment base with us, and we're dealing with really scary big experiences, yes, the clinician is there, but they're just kind of inside. We may be actually re-traumatizing them because it's the very thing that they did as a child. They had to do it all on their own. Right. So with directional, we can use things like EMDR, internal family systems, Hakomi mindfulness or mindfulness. We can engage in a form of therapy well with the psychedelic. And that can range from psycholytic, a low dose. That can be very powerful. We don't have to do this, big, huge psychedelic experience. We might, if it's appropriate and we've assessed and we've decided that dose is appropriate. But we can also just as effectively, and I think maybe even more effectively, especially for certain people who are highly sensitive and have certain conditions, that they're better off actually with that psycholytic low dose. And I do this with, there's a company I'm part of, and I just finished a training, a teaching with them. We're about to put out a course with Palo Alto University. It's a certification training for clinicians who do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and it's through Joyous Health, or sorry, Joyous is the company, and they do low dose psychedelic ketamine. And so it can be very directive where you're engaging and you're just actually still doing therapy, but their default mode network, right? Their prefrontal cortex, that constant mind chatter and analysis is quieted enough that they can still access and go in to the deeper memories and the somatic piece that just turns down the volume for them to say, oh, I can actually feel this, what I have not been able to feel because my mind has been holding it to the point where I've had to just try and think my way and analyze out of it. And we can't do that with trauma, unfortunately. We have to feel it to an extent and then form a new relationship with it. My new book. Well, this is my first and only book I've ever written. It's in the final stages of being edited. So I am just sort of waiting on that to be complete, and I'm hoping to put it out in the new year. So the book is called From Grief to Love, Finding Joy in the Wake of Loss. And it is a blend of some of my personal story, of which I shared today about my father, his brain injury, and how that led me on a path to become a therapist, and the foundation of the book is through the lens of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, if you're familiar with that. Again, being a history major, I study a lot of Greek mythology and archetypes and mythology, and so I love the foundation for this idea of how it informs us on the journey that we're all on, right? We're all on this individual and collective hero's journey. And so the book is a blend of personal story with psychoeducation and really a guide to grief and moving from grief, right, to an experience of love. So alchemizing grief into joy and into finding your life purpose and path, perhaps even for some people, is what happens in this grief work when they do it. People can get in touch with me through my website, JacquelineRobertson.com, email Jacqueline Sarah with an H at protonmail.com. They can reach out there. There's a contact page, set up a consultation, or, just reach out and let me know what their need is, and we can go from there.